This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 6. The Buccaneers. Once more the blacks formed a circle around our adventurer, who coolly drew his tube and said to the chief, "Tell your people I'm going to walk away through those trees, and if anyone dares to interfere with me, I'll paralyze him." The chief understood enough English to catch his meaning, and repeated the message to his men. Having seen the terrible effect of the electric tube, they wisely fell back and allowed the boy to pass. He marched through their lines with a fine air of dignity, although he was fearful lest some of the blacks should stick a spear into him or bump his head with a war club. But they were awed by the wonders they had seen, and were still inclined to believe him a god, so he was not molested. When he found himself outside the village, he made for the high plateau in the center of the island, where he could be safe from the cannibals while he collected his thoughts. But when he reached the place, he found the sides so steep he could not climb them, so he adjusted the indicator to the word "up," and found it had still enough power to support his body while he clambered up the rocks to the level, grass-covered space at the top. Then, reclining upon his back, he gave himself up to thoughts of how he might escape from his unpleasant predicament. "Here I am on a cannibal island, hundreds of miles from civilization, with no way to get back," he reflected. "The family will look for me every day and finally decide I've broken my neck. The Demon will call upon me when the week is up and won't find me at home, so I'll miss the next 3 gifts. I don't mind that so much, for they might bring me into worse scrapes than this. But how am I to get away from this beastly island? I'll be eaten after all if I don't look out." These and similar thoughts occupied him for some time, yet in spite of much planning and thinking he could find no practical means of escape. At the end of an hour he looked over the edge of the plateau and found it surrounded by a ring of the black cannibals, who had calmly seated themselves to watch his movements. "Perhaps they intend to starve me into surrender," he thought, "but they won't succeed so long as my tablets hold out. And if, in time, they should starve me, I'll be too thin and tough to make good eating, so I'll get the best of them anyhow." Then he lay down again and began to examine his electrical traveling machine. He did not dare take it apart, fearing he might not be able to get it together again, for he knew nothing at all about its construction. But he discovered 2 little dents on the edge, one on each side, which had evidently been caused by the pressure of the rope. If I could get those dents out, he thought, the machine might work. He first tried to pry out the edges with his pocket knife, but the attempt resulted in failure. Then, as the sides seemed a little bulged outward by the dents, he placed the machine between 2 flat stones and pressed them together until the little instrument was nearly round again. The dents remained, to be sure, but he hoped he had removed the pressure upon the works. There was just one way to discover how well he had succeeded, so he fastened the machine to his wrist and turned the indicator to the word "up." Slowly he ascended, this time to a height of nearly 20 feet. Then his progress became slower and finally ceased altogether. "That's a little better," he thought. "Now let's see if it will go sideways." He put the indicator to northwest, the direction of home, and very slowly the machine obeyed and carried him away from the plateau and across the island. The natives saw him go, and springing to their feet began uttering excited shouts and throwing their spears at him. But he was already so high and so far away that they failed to reach him, and the boy continued his journey unharmed. Once the branches of a tall tree caught him and nearly tipped him over, but he managed to escape others by drawing up his feet. At last he was free of the island and traveling over the ocean again. He was not at all sorry to bid good-bye to the cannibal island, but he was worried about the machine, which clearly was not in good working order. The vast ocean was beneath him, and he moved no faster than an ordinary walk. "At this rate I'll get home sometime next year," he grumbled. "However, I suppose I ought to be glad the machine works at all." And he really was glad. All the afternoon and all the long summer night he moved slowly over the water. It was annoying to go at a regular jog trot, as Rob called it, after his former swift flight, but there was no help for it. Just as dawn was breaking he saw in the distance a small vessel, sailing in the direction he was following, yet scarcely moving for lack of wind. He soon caught up with it, but saw no one on deck, and the craft had a dingy and uncared for appearance that was not reassuring. But after hovering over it for some time, Rob decided to board the ship and rest for a while. He alighted near the bow, where the deck was highest, and was about to explore the place when a man came out of the low cabin and espied him. This person had a most villainous countenance and was dark-skinned, black-bearded, and dressed in an outlandish, piratical costume. On seeing the boy, he gave a loud shout and was immediately joined by 4 companions, each as disagreeable in appearance as the first. Rob knew there would be trouble the moment he looked at this evil crew, and when they drew their daggers and pistols and began fiercely shouting in an unknown tongue, the boy sighed and took the electric tube from his coat pocket. The Buccaneers did not notice the movement, but rushed upon him so quickly that he had to press the button at a lively rate. The tube made no noise at all, so it was a strange and remarkable sight to see the pirates suddenly drop to the deck and lie motionless. Indeed, one was so nearly upon him when the electric current struck him that his head, in falling, bumped against Rob's stomach and sent him reeling against the side of the vessel. He quickly recovered himself, and seeing his enemies were rendered harmless, the boy entered the cabin and examined it curiously. It was dirty and ill-smelling enough, but the corners and spare berths were heaped with merchandise of all kinds, which had been taken from those so unlucky as to have met these cruel and desperate men. After a short inspection of the place, he returned to the deck and again seated himself in the bow. The crippled condition of his traveling machine was now his chief trouble, and although a good breeze had sprung up to fill the sails and the little bark was making fair headway, Rob knew he could never expect to reach home unless he could discover a better mode of conveyance than this. He unstrapped the machine from his wrist to examine it better, and while holding it carelessly in his hand, it slipped and fell with a bang to the deck, striking upon its round edge and rolling quickly past the cabin and out of sight. With a cry of alarm he ran after it, and after much search found it lying against the bulwark near the edge of a scupper hole, where the least jar of the ship would have sent it to the bottom of the ocean. Rob hastily seized his treasure, and upon examining it found the fall had bulged the rim so that the old dents scarcely showed at all. But its original shape was more distorted than ever, and Rob feared he had utterly ruined its delicate mechanism. Should this prove to be true, he might now consider himself a prisoner of this piratical band, the members of which, although temporarily disabled, would soon regain consciousness. He sat in the bow, thinking sadly of his misfortunes, until he noticed that one of the men began to stir. The effect of the electrical shock conveyed by the tube was beginning to wear away, and now the buccaneer sat up, rubbed his head in a bewildered fashion, and looked around him. When he saw Rob, he gave a shout of rage and drew his knife, but one motion of the electric tube made him cringe and slip away to the cabin, where he remained out of danger. And now the other 4 sat up, groaning and muttering in their outlandish speech, but they had no notion of facing Rob's tube a second time, so one by one they joined their leader in the cabin, leaving the boy undisturbed. By this time the ship had begun to pitch and toss in an uncomfortable fashion, and Rob noticed that the breeze had increased to a gale. There being no one to look after the sails, the vessel was in grave danger of capsizing or breaking her masts. The waves were now running high, too, and Rob began to be worried. Presently the captain of the pirates stuck his head out of the cabin door, jabbered some unintelligible words, and pointed to the sails. The boy nodded, for he understood they wanted to attend to the rigging. So the crew trooped forth rather fearfully and began to reef the sails and put the ship into condition to weather the storm. Rob paid no further attention to them. He looked at his traveling machine rather doubtfully and wondered if he dared risk its power to carry him through the air. Whether he remained in the ship or trusted to the machine, he stood a good chance of dropping into the sea at any moment. So while he hesitated, he attached the machine to his wrist, and leaned over the bulwarks to